So it's good to be back. And just to let you know, because I've had some questions about the time that I was away, my mother did finally have her surgery that she was supposed to have back in April. And it went very, very well. In fact, she was supposed to be in the hospital for 3 days, and she was there for just barely 24 hours, and they sent her home right away. The other question I've received quite often, given the weather report for today, is why did I pack the Arizona weather in my suitcase on the way back? It is because the airline I was flying gave me another bag to check, and I just, as a guy who can't pass up a deal, I had to take it. So I just stuck it in that extra suitcase and brought it back. You're welcome. So I know you just are going to appreciate the 100-degree day we're going to have today. But it brings us to a good way of thinking about today's text in Romans. It seems to kind of, come out of nowhere a little bit and not be really related to what has come before. But there seems to be in the church in Rome some question about whether the Jews are still a part of God's people. So maybe even some of the Gentiles now, these non-Jewish believers, are thinking, well, we have Jesus, and so now we have supplanted the Jews as God's people. And if you read this carefully, Paul is arguing against that line of thinking. Yes, Jesus has come to bring more into the family of God, but as Paul mentions in this little snippet of Romans, that doesn't make God's promise to his people invalid. It's still valid. In fact, Paul is saying, look at me. I am a Jew, and if we read elsewhere, he says, right, I am a Hebrew of Hebrews. He is the guy, he was one of the top people in the leadership of God's people. He was zealous for the Torah. He was zealous for the study. He was zealous for everything that it meant to be a Jewish man. And here he is teaching these Christians, these new Christians, and he's saying God's promise to God's people is not invalid. Even though they might not, some of them might not understand the full truth of what we have now come to know, God does not abandon them. So this is a problem. This is an issue. This is however you want to talk about it. This still happens today. It still does, writ large, in political conversations, but also in theological or church conversations. Just before the pandemic shutdown, I was at PLU for a conference, and a woman came to speak who was an African-American woman who and I was trying to find my notes, I couldn't find them, and I can't remember the exact group that she ran, but it was a group for rape survivors. And she herself was a survivor, and she advocated for women who had been sexually abused, raped, all those things. And she came at it from her place in the world as an African-American woman. And it was interesting to watch her speak to a mostly white audience of college-educated or in the process of being college-educated people, most of whom probably considered themselves enlightened and anti-racist. And it was interesting to listen to this woman speak, and she looked at all of us, and she said that somebody asked her about the divisions in our society. And in particular, people were talking about going home to their family and talking to the family members who were, let's just say nicely, less enlightened. And she looked at the group of people, and she very calmly looked at all of us and said, the problem is that we're talking about these conversations in an either or, an A or B. They're not A and B. Unfortunately, she said, what we try to do in our conversations is we say, you have to either be 100% with me or you're against me. And so she started talking about and playing with these percentages a little bit. And she said, there are the people who are 100% with me, so I don't need to really talk to them. So then there are other people who are 90% with me. There's 10% that we just don't agree on. And maybe we are absolutely cannot come to an agreement with that 10%. And so then she went on to say, you know what? If I can agree with you 90% of the way, we have a conversation about that 10%, but I'm okay with agreeing to disagree on that 10%. And she went on along the way. And she said there comes a point where there really are people who we just have 0% where we can agree with each other. But the issue is that group of people is really, really small. It is way smaller than we give it credit for. We think that the people that we have 0 in common with, 0 in agreement with, is 90% of the people out there, when the reality is it's probably somewhere less than 1%. And I think that's the point that Paul is trying to make with the Roman Christians, who are trying to see themselves as supplanting God's people, the Hebrews, as God's favored ones, and saying that those who are not 100% on board with everything that they preach and teach about Jesus are to be thrown away and left aside. And instead, Paul is saying, no, God made a promise to God's people, and God always keeps God's promises. Nothing can void them. And quite honestly, that is very reassuring to me. Because you know what, if we're really honest with ourselves, there are a lot of times we are not 100% on board with what God is calling us to in Jesus. Maybe way more than we'd like to admit. That there are times when Jesus calls us to some really hard choices in our lives, where Jesus calls us to love some really unlovable people in our lives. That Jesus calls us sometimes to love the most unlovable person in our life, ourselves, and all of our warts and all of our mistakes, and to throw ourselves on the mercy of God and know that God's love and mercy is big enough and large enough and abundant enough to forgive and love and cover, yes, even you and even me, despite all of the times when we're not 100% on board with God. God is always 100% on board with us. That's a promise that we can live with. That's a promise that will continue to sustain us throughout anything that this messy life of ours will throw at us. No one is beyond the love of God. No one is outside of God's family. We have this assurance, this truth, this love to share. As we go about our days and weeks ahead, as we meet the people that we meet, as we have the conversations that we have, and yes, as we have the arguments that we're going to have, remember, as Paul was telling these early Christians about their Jewish brothers and sisters, we're reminded as well that other person, that other group of people, they're not outside the family of God either. We're all in this together. We are all the family of God.